Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa ta'ala wa barakatuh. Welcome to lecture number 10 of literary criticism. My name is Dr. Fouzi Slisli. Today we will be talking about a very important paper that emerged in a period in which structuralism was developing to become post-structuralism. So it's a transition period that's very important. In our previous lecture, we talked about Roland Barthes' article, The Death of the Author. Well, Foucault responds to Roland Barthes' article, The Death of the Author, and takes some of the questions that Roland Barthes raises and tries to explain the complexities and the difficulties involved. So today we will look at Michel Foucault's paper, What is an Author? It is a response to the work that many scholars were doing at the time about the idea of the author and authorship, the importance of the author, the necessity of the author. Can we get rid of the author? Can we create a literary culture in which the reader is central? Is the author an obstacle for the development of literature? So these were questions that emerged with Russian formalism, who encouraged us to look at the text without any considerations of the author or context, just the text and the signifying structures of the text. Like a linguist looks at language, a literary critic looks at the language of the text and tries to understand the signifying processes that are included in the text and try to stay away from any other considerations, whether the author, where did the author grow up, what's his politics, what's his ideology, none of those considerations are important. We just focus on the text. So after the Russian formalists, structuralists like Roland Barthes took the idea a bit further, and it culminated in Roland Barthes' essay, The Death of the Author, a very provocative title and a very provocative idea, where he argues that to liberate literature, that we need to eliminate the author from the practice of literature. He argued, as you remember, he argued that literature was constrained, limited by the function of the author, that the concept of the author functioned like a tyrant in literature, because all readings and all interpretations are limited because they have to go back to the intentions of the author. The author dominates, the author exists before the text and dominates the reading of the text through his supposed intentions. But Roland Barthes explains that the author's intentions, even if the author has intentions, those intentions are simply language explained through other language. And there is always an extra. Even if the author has intentions, the text will carry more than those intentions. There will be an extra. And it is a loss for us, readers, scholars, if we limit our reading strictly to the intentions of the author. So to free the text, to liberate the reader, Roland Barthes advised that we eliminate the author. Well, Michel Foucault takes up the idea and responds to this idea of the elimination of the author. And you can tell from his title, What is an Author? And that in a sense he wants to question some very basic assumptions that we hold about the author. What is an author? How do we define an author? What's his function in literature? So, as you can see, from even from the title, Michel Foucault is provocative. What is an author? Foucault takes an idea that most of us take as given. Most of us think that we know what an author is. But he makes us think twice. What is an author? Do we really know what an author is? His question might even seem pointless at first. You know, what do you mean? We know what's an author, but he says, hang on, wait for a second, think about it. What is an author? Foucault questions the most basic assumptions about authorship. He reminds us that the concept of authorship hasn't always existed. There were times in the medieval period when the idea of authorship didn't exist. Texts were circulating without the need for an author. There was somebody who told the story or narrated the events, a conveyor, a recorder, a witness, but there was no author. It came into being, the idea of authorship, he explains, at a particular moment in history. And like all things, it has a beginning, a middle, and maybe one day it will have an end. Maybe in the future, one day, it won't be necessary anymore for texts to function with an author. Foucault also questions our habit of thinking about authors as individuals. Basically, you can see even with the internet today how texts are finding it more difficult to function with authors. With the internet, where it is easy to just copy and paste, naskh and lasq, and the text just proliferates, is distributed across the internet, across the world, without necessarily needing an author. There is no institutions that say, well, hang on, who said this? Who is the author of this? With books, with printing, it's more difficult. You cannot publish something without giving it an author. And if it doesn't have an author, it will be difficult to classify. Where does it belong? But with the internet is already making the function of the author a little bit redundant, useless. So Foucault also questions our habit of thinking about the author as individuals, as heroic figures, as geniuses that transcend time and place and exist outside of history. Think of Shakespeare, for example. We think of Shakespeare as a genius for all time and for all place. We don't think of Shakespeare as limited to a specific historical time and a specific historical context. Why, wonders Foucault, are we so strongly inclined to view the author in that way? Why are we conditioned to look at the author in this way? Why are we often resistant to the notion that authors are produced in time and place? Why is it difficult for us? And what he's pointing out to here is that we have built a certain amount of mythology about the author. The author, being a genius, transcends his time and transcends his place. So an author exists in the 18th century, in the 19th century. He's relevant to us today. We read poetry or novels and we feel that the author is speaking to us today. So there's an element of mythology. Michel Foucault wants us to question this mythology. What is it made up of? Is it useful? Do we need it? What does it do to us? According to Foucault, Roland Barthes had urged critics to realize that they could do without the author and study the work itself. Michel Foucault says that this urging, that Roland Barthes' idea, is not realistic. It's not realistic and almost impossible to achieve at this point. Foucault suggests that critics like Barthes and even critics like Derrida never really get rid of the author. They don't get rid of the author. They claim, when Barthes tells us the death of the author and acts like he has gotten rid of the author, Foucault says, well, that's not true. He hasn't disposed of the author. Instead, Barthes and Derrida and others merely reassign the author's powers and privileges to writing to the text. Those privileges and powers that we used to give to the author, that used to be the property of the author, Barthes and Derrida eliminate the author and just reassign that mythology, that whole mythology, those functions and privileges, they reassign them to the text, to language itself. And we start building a new mythology now about the text, about language itself. Foucault doesn't want his readers to assume that the question of authorship has already been resolved by critics like Barthes and Derrida. Basically, he says, do not believe that Barthes or Derrida have solved the question of the author. The question of the author is more complex than that. He tries to show that neither Barthes nor Derrida has broken away from the question of the author, much less solved it. They haven't even broken away from the author, let alone solve it. Foucault asks us to think about the ways in which an author's name functions in our society. How does it function, an author's name? When we say Charles Dickens, for example, how does it function? What does it do? After raising questions about the functions of proper names, he goes on to say that the names of authors often serve as classificatory functions. The names of the authors have classificatory functions. Think, for example, about going to a bookstore to buy a book. Well, you're looking, say, for example, for Oliver Twist. You go into the bookstore and you're going to ask, well, do you have Oliver Twist? The clerk, the gentleman at the bookstore, the first question he will ask you, well, who is it by? Who is Oliver Twist by? So you might say, well, it's by Charles Dickens, right? Then the clerk will take you to a section of the bookstore, the section on literature, and there will be, the books will be classified in an order of letters, right? So you will look for Dickens, for the letter D, right? And you would find Charles Dickens there, and then you would look at his, books until you find Oliver Twist. It probably wouldn't occur to us. I mean, why is it when we go to a library, we go and search by the author's name? It wouldn't occur to us to search by any other criteria. We are so conditioned to classify books by the author's name that we take it for granted. So Michel Foucault says, pay attention to how we use the author as a classificatory criteria, as a classificatory function, and how we do it almost unconsciously. Now Foucault asks, why do most of us assume that it's natural for bookstores to classify books according to the names of their authors? Why is it so natural for them? What would happen to Oliver Twist if scholars were to discover that it hadn't been written by Charles Dickens? If we discover all of a sudden that Oliver Twist was not written by Charles Dickens, what would happen? Wouldn't most bookstores and wouldn't most of us feel that the novel would have to be reclassified, right? Put in a different section of the bookstore, put in a different section of books that we study. It would be looked at completely differently in the lecture hall, in the class, in the classroom, in the bookstore, in the criticism. Everywhere the book would change if we discovered that all of a sudden Oliver Twist was not written by Charles Dickens. And ask yourself again, why would we feel that way? After all, the words of the novel wouldn't have changed. I mean, if we discovered that Oliver Twist wasn't written by Charles Dickens, a lot of things would change. But why is that? Because even if the author isn't Charles Dickens, the words of the book remain the same. But why do we have to make such changes simply because of the author's name, though the text of the book remains as it is. Nothing has changed. The words remain the same, the sentences remain the same, the chapters remain the same, the story remains the same, everything remains the same. All that changes is that we discover that the book wasn't actually written by Charles Dickens, but by someone else. And this discovery will force us to reclassify the book, not only in the bookstore or the library, but even in university courses, even in the criticism, even in the analyses that we make of the book. Everything would change about it. Foucault here introduces his concept of the author function. This is what he means by the author's function, that we have an author function. We don't pay attention to it. We take it for granted, but it's there. It's the author function. It's not a person. When we say the author function, that's not a person, right? And it should not be confused with either the author, meaning the person who writes, or the writer. The author function is different. The author function is more like a set of beliefs that we have, or assumptions governing the production, circulation, classification, and consumption of literature, of texts. That's the author function. It's a set of beliefs and assumptions that govern the production, the circulation, the classification, and the consumption of texts. This is the author's function. Foucault then goes on to tell us that there is 4 characteristics to the author function. It has 4 characteristics. First of all, the author function is linked to the legal system. It has a legal dimension and arises as a result of the need to punish those responsible for transgressive statements. This function of authorship emerged when at some point when printing was invented and it became possible to print books and circulate books so fast that it became necessary to attach a name to a text, because texts could include insults or transgressive language or dangerous statements that can cause a lot of upheavals, can cause mischief, can cause slander, right? So in that case, these texts, it is necessary to find who wrote these texts in order to give punishment for that. So the need to punish transgressive text, transgressive discourse, was behind the creation of the author function. This is how courts and legal systems said, well, we will not publish texts that don't have an author, right? Because we want every text to have a name of a person who will assume responsibility for what is said. And if what they say is transgressive, we will punish them. We can find who said this, it's so-and-so. We will find them and punish them. So the author function emerged first. It emerged first because of a need to punish transgressive discourse. That's the first characteristic of the author's function. The author function, the second one, the author function, does not affect all the texts in the same way. For example, the author function does not seem to affect scientific texts in the same way that it affects literary texts. Scientific texts, a lot of the time, don't need an author, but literary texts do need an author. If a chemistry teacher is talking about the periodic table, you probably wouldn't stop her and say, wait a minute, who is the author of this table? But if I am talking about a poem, you might very well stop me and ask me about this author. Who wrote this poem? Who is the author of this poem? So the author function doesn't affect texts in the same way. It affects, for example, literary texts in a way, and it affects scientific texts in a different way. The third function The author function is more complex than it seems to be. That's the third characteristic. And it's one of probably the most difficult of Foucault's characteristics. It's more complex than it seems to be. To illustrate, Foucault gives the example of the editorial problem of attribution, the problem of deciding whether or not a given text should be attributed to a particular author. So, for example, I mean, you might think this is like a simple problem, but it's a huge problem. Think, for example, since most of the literary texts that we have been attributed in a more or less reliable way to an author. So we know that the sonnets are by Shakespeare, we know that Hamlet was written by Shakespeare, we know that Oliver Twist was written by Charles Dickens, right? Imagine, however, a case in which a scholar discovers a long forgotten poem. Here is a long, big poem from the 16th century. It doesn't have an author, it doesn't have a name on it. Imagine, furthermore, if the scholar had a hunch, a guess, makes a guess that the author of the poem was William Shakespeare. So, you know, one day the critic would come and say, hey, you guys, I have found this long poem. It dates from the 16th century. It doesn't have an author, but I think it is by Shakespeare. What would the scholar have to do? What rules would this scholar have to observe? What standards would he have to meet in order to convince us and convince everybody else that she is right? Right? What would this scholar have to prove to show that, yes, this text was written by Shakespeare? And the short answer is that this scholar would need a lot. They would need a lot to prove that this text was by Shakespeare. The fourth function, the fourth characteristic of the author function is that it doesn't simply refer to an individual, to a real individual. We tend to think of the author simply as an individual, a writer. But the author function is not. It doesn't refer necessarily to an individual, doesn't refer to a writer, and doesn't necessarily refer to a narrator. Foucault suggests that he or she can be an alter ego. That basically the author function is a classificatory, systemic, organizational function. It's not simply the name of an individual who wrote the book, or the name of a person who, or the character who narrates the story. Another important point that Foucault makes is that the author function applies to discourse, to larger discourse, not just to a character, to a person. Think, for example, of Marx, or Marxism, or Freud and Freudianism, right? There is some thinkers or philosophers or scholars who write a book, and that book includes the rules that allow the development of an entire discourse that always goes back to this book. For example, Karl Marx wrote The Capital, and this book allowed the development of Marxism, a whole tradition of writing, of thinking, of philosophizing, all of it called Marxism, and all of it traces its origin back to Karl Marx's book, The Capital. The same thing with Freud, and there's same thing with existentialism, the same thing with, these are founders, what Foucault calls founders of discursivity. An author that writes a book, it's so complex and it has governing rules that can allow the development of a tradition of thought. Madrasa fikriya. And all of those books come back when you say, you look at this book, you say, oh, this book belongs to Marxism, right? And here it's the author function that also uses this classificatory function that allows the organization, the classification of texts in this fashion. Foucault basically raises the possibility of doing a historical analysis of discourse. He says we can analyze discourse, the history of discourse. We can analyze it from this perspective. How did the author function? What part did it play to organize discourse over hundreds of years to the point where we are? He says we can do that. If we pay attention to the author function, we can study the history of books and texts and explain how the author function has allowed us to classify texts and books according to a system of classification. And remember here that he began his essay by asking us to imagine why do we think of authors as outside time and place? We tend to think of authors as existing outside history, and that's wrong. He says if we pay attention to the function of the author, we would start seeing authors as belonging to specific time and place. And we would start to understand how the author's function has allowed the classification of books and texts over hundreds of years. Foucault, in the end, argues that the author is not a source of infinite meaning, but rather part of a system of beliefs that serve to limit and restrict meaning. For example, we often appeal to the idea of authorial intentions to limit what someone might say about a text. So if we have a text and you have something to say about it, I would say, well, that's not true because the author's intentions are A, B, C, D. So your interpretation of the text, if it doesn't meet with the author's function, then it becomes wrong. Your reading becomes wrong. So in this sense, the author's function plays a part of marking what's allowed to be said about this text and what's not allowed to be said about the text. And basically determine what's a legitimate interpretation of a text and what's an illegitimate interpretation of the text. You might say that the author's intention, the idea of the author's intention, plays a policing role. It polices interpretation and classifies what's a legitimate interpretation and what's an illegitimate interpretation. And to be a legitimate interpretation, you have to conform to the author's intentions. At the very end, towards the end, Foucault returns to Roland Barthes' ideas and he agrees with Barthes that the author function may soon disappear. Yes, it might disappear soon. He disagrees, though, that instead of the limiting and restrictive author function, he will have some kind of absolute freedom. He says, you know, if the author's function disappear, it doesn't mean that we will have some absolute freedom now, that now we can have the freedom to read and interpret any way we want. Most likely, he says, one set of restrictions and limits, the author, will give way to another set of restrictions and limits. If the author function disappears, it just means that another set of restrictions and limits will be imposed. There must, Foucault says, insists that there must and always will be some system of constraints and restrictions working upon us. And with this, we come to the end of this presentation. Thank you very much for following. I hope it has been useful, and I hope to see you in our coming lectures. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa ta'ala wa barakatuh.